Picture this, the year is 1796. The most powerful woman in Europe has just died, not in battle, not in a palace coup, not even in her imperial bed. She collapsed quietly in a private bathroom, and the world should have mourned the loss of an empress who conquered territories larger than most kingdoms. But within hours, something far more sinister began to spread through the corridors of power, across the cobblestones of St. Petersburg and into every salon and tavern from Paris to Vienna. Not tributes to her brilliance, not chronicles of her victories, but a lie so grotesque, so perfectly weaponized that it would outlive every single one of her achievements. On that cold November morning in 1796, the Winter Palace that had witnessed her coronation, her triumphs, and her transformation from disposable foreign bride to absolute sovereign, now became the birthplace of history's most vicious rumor. The image that would haunt her legacy forever wasn't of Catherine the Conqueror, Catherine the patron of arts, or Catherine the military strategist. It was of a woman in crimson velvet, alone in a gilded chamber, face to face with a massive black stallion. An image of scandal, an image of shame, an image that never happened but would be repeated for centuries as if it were fact. Before we unravel this lie, drop a quick comment, tell me if you've heard this rumor and what version reached you. I want to know how far this weapon of propaganda has traveled. They painted her next to horses, not on them, commanding armies, not riding them into battle like she actually did during the 1762 coup. Next to them, in intimate proximity, in vulnerable positions. And that deliberate visual choice became the most sophisticated character assassination ever deployed against a woman who refused to apologize for her power. The woman staring up at that stallion with wide eyes and parted lips, dressed in the deep red of imperial authority, but positioned like a victim. This is how history chose to remember the autocrat who expanded Russia by over 200,000 square miles. This is how they chose to frame the empress who built the Hermitage, corresponded with Voltaire as an intellectual equal, and crushed rebellions with the efficiency of any male czar before her. But here's what nobody wants to talk about. That image, that rumor, that scandal, it wasn't random. It wasn't gossip gone wild. It wasn't even really about what happened in that palace. It was about what they needed you to believe happened. Because the woman in red wasn't weak. She wasn't a victim, and she certainly wasn't what the lie claimed she was. The answer to why this rumor exists reveals something far more disturbing than the scandal itself. It exposes how empires fall not through military defeat, but through the deliberate destruction of memory. How powerful women throughout history have been erased not by armies, but by images visceral enough to bypass reason entirely. How truth doesn't stand a chance when the lie is crafted perfectly enough to weaponize the very symbols of a woman's strength against her. To understand why they created this image, why they chose horses, why they chose this specific narrative, why the lie spread faster than any military campaign Catherine ever launched, you first have to understand the woman they were trying to destroy. And the power she wielded that terrified them so completely, they spent centuries ensuring you'd never see past the scandal to the truth beneath it. Catherine wasn't born Catherine. She arrived in Russia as Sophia Augusta Frederica, a 14-year-old German princess with no prospects, no power, and no illusions about what awaited her. The moment her carriage rolled through the gates of the Winter Palace in 1744, she understood the language of the empire she was entering. It wasn't spoken in Russian or German. It was spoken in hoofbeats. Power in the Russian Empire rode on horseback, military reviews that shook the ground with thousands of cavalry. Imperial processions where the Tsar's authority was measured by the quality of his stallions. Masculine dominance displayed through horsemanship, through control of these massive, dangerous animals that represented conquest itself. Sophia watched all of this from carriage windows, from palace balconies, from the margins where women were expected to remain. She watched and she learned. Her marriage to Grand Duke Peter should have been her entry into power. Instead, it became 17 years of systematic humiliation. Peter was erratic, emotionally stunted, obsessed with Prussian military toys rather than actual statecraft. He paraded mistresses before her. He mocked her in front of the court. He played with miniature soldiers while the empire demanded real leadership. Their marriage remained unconsummated for years, a public humiliation that reduced Sophia to a decorative irrelevance. But while Peter played with toys, Catherine learned to ride real horses. Not side saddle, not decorously. Not in the gentle manner expected of noblewomen. She rode like the cavalry officers she studied. She joined hunts and kept pace with men who assumed she'd fall behind. She learned cavalry tactics, studied military formations, understood that in Russia, the person who commanded horses commanded respect. Every ride was an act of defiance. Every hunt was a political statement. Every moment in the saddle was preparation for something Peter was too arrogant to see coming. The transformation from Sophia to Catherine wasn't just a name change. It was a complete reinvention. She mastered Russian until she spoke it more eloquently than the nobles who'd been born into it. She converted to orthodoxy with a devotion that shamed Peter's Lutheran indifference. She built alliances quietly, methodically, with military officers and guards who recognized competence when they saw it. And when Peter finally ascended to the throne in 1761 and immediately began alienating every power base in the empire, Catherine was ready. June 28, 1762. The coup that changed everything didn't happen in a throne room or a council chamber. It happened on horseback. Catherine arrived at the barracks of the Izmailovsky regiment wearing a guard's uniform, mounted on a white Orloff stallion, sword at her side. The woman who'd arrived powerless in a carriage was now leading troops. The princess who'd been mocked for 17 years was now commanding the loyalty of armed men. Peter abdicated within hours. He was dead within days. European courts published satirical prints showing Catherine on horseback, meant to mock her for performing masculinity, for violating the natural order, for daring to command like a man. But the mockery backfired. The image made her iconic. The woman on the warhorse became the symbol of her power. And that symbol, that association between Catherine and horses, between her authority and these magnificent animals, would eventually become the weapon her enemies used to destroy everything she built. The woman who arrived powerless on a carriage left powerful on a warhorse. And that image would eventually destroy her. Catherine came to power the way storms arrive, suddenly, violently, with a force that reshapes everything it touches. And from the moment she seized the throne, every conquest she made was measured in hoofbeats. Russia's expansion under her rule wasn't won through diplomacy or patient negotiation. It was won through cavalry charges, through thousands of mounted soldiers thundering across frontiers, through the calculated deployment of horse-powered military might that crushed anyone who stood in her way. The Ottoman Empire learned this the hard way. Twice. Catherine launched two major wars against the Turks, and both were decided by Russian cavalry divisions that swept across the Black Sea frontier like an unstoppable tide. The Crimean annexation in 1783 wasn't secured through treaties alone. It was secured by mounted Cossacks who understood that territory belongs to whoever can hold it by force. Her army's horses trampled across conquered lands from the Baltic to the Black Sea, their hoofbeats the soundtrack to an empire swelling beyond anything Europe had seen in generations. Visual propaganda from the era shows Catherine exactly as she wanted to be seen, a military commander on horseback, sword raised, leading her forces like any male sovereign before her. The image was deliberate. The message was clear. Power rode on horseback, and Catherine rode better than most men, but here's where the association becomes dangerous. The men Catherine chose as lovers weren't poets or philosophers seeking her favor. They were cavalry officers, horse breeders, military strategists whose entire identity was bound to the animals that symbolized Russian might. Grigory Orlov, the man who helped orchestrate the coup that put her on the throne, was a cavalry officer and master of the imperial stables. He bred the finest horses in Russia, understood their power, commanded them with the same authority Catherine commanded her empire. Their affair wasn't just romantic, it was tactical. He brought military loyalty. She brought the throne. The horses were always there, connecting them. Then came Grigory Potemkin, perhaps the most complex relationship of her reign, military genius, political visionary. The man who reorganized Russian cavalry into a force that terrified Europe. He created legendary horse breeding programs that turned Russian stallions into symbols of imperial dominance. Whether they were lovers, co-rulers, or secret spouses remains debated, but what's undeniable is this. Potemkin's power and Catherine's power were both measured in cavalry strength. The association formed like a chain being forged link by link. Catherine's authority equals military might equals cavalry dominance equals horses equals the men who commanded them. Her enemies were watching. They were taking notes. Catherine's cultural ambitions reinforced the connection. The Hermitage, her obsession, filled with equestrian portraits of monarchs. Alexander on Bucephalus, Napoleon on his charger, kings and emperors immortalized on horseback. Court ceremonies became elaborate displays of horse parades. Prized stallions marching through palace grounds in formations that demonstrated wealth, power, and control. Her personal stable housed dozens of the finest stallions money could buy. Each one a symbol of authority, each one another piece of evidence for those collecting material against her. Then came the Pugachev Rebellion in 1773, and the contradiction deepened into something irreversible. A Cossack named Yemelian Pugachev gathered thousands by claiming to be her murdered husband, promising liberation for the oppressed. Catherine's response was as swift as it was brutal. Mounted troops crushed the rebellion with systematic violence. Pugachev was dragged to Moscow in a cage and executed publicly. His followers were hanged along the roads, their bodies left swaying as warnings. The horses that symbolized her conquests abroad now symbolized her oppression at home, enlightened empress on the surface, iron autocrat beneath. And always, always the horses were there. Exiled nobles in Paris salons began collecting material. Foreign spies documented every military parade. Satirical writers in London and Vienna catalogued every lover, every cavalry review, every public appearance where Catherine and horses shared the frame. They couldn't defeat her armies. They couldn't reclaim their lost territories, but they could build a narrative. Piece by piece, image by image, they were preparing a weapon more powerful than any cavalry charge. They just needed her to die first. They couldn't beat her cavalry, so they made the cavalry beat her. The propaganda campaign against Catherine the Great didn't emerge fully formed the moment she died. It evolved. It was refined. It was tested and adjusted over decades until her enemies found the perfect weapon, one that used her own symbols of power to destroy her legacy forever. The early caricatures were almost quaint by comparison. Satirical prints from the 1760s and 70s showed Catherine riding horses aggressively, sword raised, uniform tight across her chest. The intent was mockery. Look at this woman performing masculinity, violating the natural order, pretending to be what she could never be. But the mockery didn't land the way her enemies hoped. If anything, it made her more formidable. A woman on horseback commanding armies was threatening, yes, but it was also undeniably powerful. The image had to evolve. By mid-reign, the propaganda shifted. Now the satirical prints showed Catherine with her military lovers and horses in the same frame. Grigory Orlov holding reins while Catherine gazed at him. Potemkin reviewing cavalry while she stood close enough to suggest intimacy. The horses were no longer just vehicles of military power. They were becoming proximate to sexuality, to her romantic choices, to the whispers about her appetites. The association was deliberate. Her power came from horses and the men who commanded them. Her pleasure came from those same men. The propaganda was building a bridge between conquest and desire, between military dominance and sexual impropriety. By late reign, the imagery had metastasized into something far more sinister. Suggestive illustrations showed horses in her private chambers. Sexual innuendo built like pressure in a sealed vessel. Anonymous pamphlets circulated through European courts with increasingly explicit theories about her preferences. The transformation was complete. Horses had gone from symbols of her imperial might to instruments of her alleged depravity. From conquest to perversion, from strength to scandal. But why did horses work so perfectly as weapons? The answer reveals the sick genius of the campaign. Horses were already associated with Catherine in every European mind. Her military reviews, her cavalry victories, her conquest of Crimea, the Orlov stallions, Potemkin's breeding programs. Every portrait, every ceremony, every triumph featured horses. Her enemies didn't need to create a new symbol, they just needed to corrupt the existing one. Take what made her powerful and twist it into something grotesque. Horses also represented the masculine domain she'd invaded: warfare. Cavalry command, physical strength, political authority. Everything a woman wasn't supposed to touch, she'd not only touched but mastered. By connecting horses to sexual scandal, the propaganda transformed her violation of gender norms from threatening competence into unnatural deviance. She didn't just rule like a man, she allegedly desired like a monster. And here's the darkest truth: bestiality allegations have always been wielded asymmetrically. Male rulers throughout history faced accusations of sexual excess, even perversion, and emerged with reputations intact or even enhanced. But level the same. Accusation at a woman and it destroys everything. It reduces decades of achievement to a single obscene image. It transforms political legacy into pornographic joke. The taboo was ancient, visceral, and perfectly suited to obliterate a woman who refused to perform weakness. The rumors during her lifetime were the groundwork. Whispers circulated about her stable visits. Why did the Empress spend so much time among the horses? Jokes spread about her preference for cavalry officers. Was it their military skill she admired or something else? Anonymous pamphlets appeared at royal courts across Europe, each one more explicit than the last, each one testing how far the lie could be pushed while Catherine still lived and could theoretically defend herself. But Catherine was too powerful to confront gossip directly. Responding would legitimize it. Ignoring it allowed the poison to spread. By the 1790s, the pieces were in place. Revolutionary France despised her for opposing their cause and harboring aristocratic refugees. Conservative monarchies resented her dominance and her Enlightenment pretensions. The Orthodox Church criticized her Western influences and her German origins. And her own son Paul, poisoned by years of resentment and suspicion that she'd orchestrated his father's death, waited with barely concealed hatred for the throne he believed she'd stolen from him. They were all waiting, waiting for her to die, waiting for the moment when she could no longer command armies, silence critics, or project the overwhelming force of personality that had kept the lie contained. They had spent decades building the weapon. They just needed her mortality to pull the trigger. And on November 16, 1796, they finally got their chance. November 16, 1796, the day truth died. Catherine the Great collapsed in her private bathroom, a stroke shutting down the body that had endured 67 years of transformation, humiliation, triumph, and unrelenting ambition. Servants found her on the marble floor. Physicians documented everything: the timing, the symptoms, the witnesses. She was carried to her bed where she drifted into unconsciousness and died the following morning. No horses, no scandal, no drama. Just the ordinary failure of a human body that had been pushed beyond ordinary limits for 3 decades. But within weeks, the weapon her enemies had been building for years was finally unleashed. Crude satirical prints appeared in Paris, then London, then Vienna. The image they depicted was obscene in its precision. Catherine suspended above a stallion by an elaborate harness system, the mechanism failing, her body falling. The setting was unmistakably her palace, the gilded walls, the marble floors, the opulence that symbolized her power. The image worked because it combined every symbol they'd carefully associated with her over decades. Her palace, her horses, her alleged sexual appetites. One grotesque tableau that bypassed reason entirely and lodged directly in cultural memory. Physical impossibility didn't matter. The mechanics made no sense. The witnesses contradicted it. The documented medical records proved otherwise. None of that could compete with an image visceral enough to tap into deep, ancient fears about powerful women. The lie used her own symbols against her with devastating efficiency. The horses that represented her cavalry conquering Crimea now represented her allegedly conquering taboos. The masculine authority she'd wielded became twisted proof of unnatural desire. And here's the gender-specific cruelty. Male rulers' sexual excess was virility, conquest, royal prerogative. Hers became bestial, monstrous, a violation of nature itself. The lie didn't just survive, it thrived. By the 1800s, it appeared in gossip books as confirmed scandal. By the 1900s, it had calcified into historical fact, repeated by people who'd never questioned its source. By the 2000s, it became internet memes, casual jokes, the first thing mentioned whenever her name appeared. The image of woman plus horse plus scandal outlived everything else. Her 200,000 square miles of territorial expansion, her creation of the Hermitage, her military dominance, her cultural revolution. Achievement buried under obscenity. This wasn't random. This was strategic visual propaganda executed with surgical precision. They chose horses because horses were her power. The rumor transformed conquest, her cavalry literally conquering territories, into depravity, her allegedly conquering sexual boundaries. Powerful women aren't defeated by armies. They're defeated by images that reduce complexity to mockery, that flatten legacy into punchline. Pull back to that woman in the red gown, kneeling before the black stallion, eyes wide with shock. That image of vulnerability is fiction. The real Catherine faced down the Ottoman Empire. She crushed rebellions. She outmaneuvered every European power that tried to contain her. She ruled an empire larger than most men could dream of conquering. The ultimate irony, they needed a lie this grotesque to overshadow a truth this magnificent. The next time you see that image, Catherine and the horse, remember this. The powerful women are always depicted next to the symbols they conquered. The scandal wasn't what she did. It was that she refused to stop doing it. She wouldn't apologize. She wouldn't perform weakness. She wouldn't shrink. And for that, they spent centuries ensuring you'd never see past the lie to the woman who terrified them enough to require its invention. If this changed how you see history, hit that like button. Comment your country and whether you'd heard this rumor before. I want to map how far this weapon traveled. Subscribe because history's biggest lies deserve the truth. And share this with someone who needs to know that powerful women have always been dangerous enough to require centuries of slander. Catherine conquered empires. They conquered